Tim Blake Nelson confesses what happened with Buster Scruggs. I used to think Buster Scruggs was one of those performances an actor just had in him. The smile, the guitar, the white suit, the effortless gun tricks. Then I found out how much work was hiding underneath that performance, and honestly, it changed the way I saw Tim Blake Nelson. Because Buster Scruggs wasn't natural talent pretending to be hard work. It was hard work pretending to be natural talent. And the story gets even better when you realize who was teaching him. Tim Blake Nelson was already an unusual actor long before he became Buster Scruggs. He wasn't the typical Hollywood cowboy type. He came from Tulsa, Oklahoma, studied classics at Brown University, graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and then went to Juilliard. That alone tells you something about him. This wasn't a guy who spent his childhood imagining himself riding through the Old West. He was a classics scholar who somehow ended up playing ridiculous characters in movies. And I think that's part of what makes his career so interesting. He never seemed desperate to be the hero. He seemed much more comfortable being the strange guy standing 3 feet away from the hero. That's where he found the comedy. That's where he found the humanity. And eventually, that's where the Coen brothers found him. Years before Buster Scruggs, Joel and Ethan Coen had already worked with Nelson on Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And that experience planted a strange little idea. After hearing Nelson sing, the brothers joked that someday he should play a singing cowboy. It sounded ridiculous. Nelson didn't exactly look like the traditional Hollywood image of a gunslinger, but the joke stayed alive for years. Then, nearly 2 decades later, Joel Coen walked over to Nelson's apartment with a script. The character was Buster Scruggs, a singing cowboy, a fast-talking gunslinger, a cheerful outlaw dressed almost entirely in white. And suddenly, that old joke wasn't a joke anymore. I can only imagine what Nelson thought when he saw the part. Because getting the role was one thing, actually becoming Buster Scruggs was another. The character needed to sing, he needed to play guitar, he needed to handle a revolver like it was an extension of his hand, and of course he needed to ride a horse while doing all of that. That last part was a problem. Nelson wasn't some lifelong cowboy, so he had months to prepare. And one of the most surprising parts of the story is that his own teenage son helped teach him guitar. Think about that for a second. The actor playing one of cinema's most confident singing gunslingers was privately learning guitar from his own kid. I love that detail because it destroys the illusion. On screen, Buster looks like he could wake up, grab a guitar, mount a horse, and start performing without thinking twice. Behind the camera, Nelson was practicing. Over and over, he was learning the songs, working on the guitar, practicing pistol tricks, trying to make the movements look casual. And that's where I think his real talent becomes obvious. He understood something that great actors understand. The audience shouldn't see the work. They should see the result. So when Buster spins that revolver, you're not supposed to think, Tim Blake Nelson practiced this for months. You're supposed to think, of course this guy can do that. And that's exactly what happened. The performance became so convincing that the preparation almost disappeared. People assumed he was simply born to play Buster Scruggs. But Nelson later made it clear that there was nothing effortless about it. And strangely, that makes the performance even more impressive. Because Buster himself is almost the definition of confidence. He walks around like nothing can possibly go wrong. He sings, he jokes, he shoots, he smiles. Everything feels like a performance. And Nelson had to build that confidence from scratch. That's the part that really stayed with me, because his career has always contained that same contradiction. He's an incredibly educated actor who often chooses to play fools, a serious performer who seems perfectly happy looking ridiculous, someone who could easily chase prestigious leading man roles but repeatedly chooses characters that other actors might consider embarrassing. He once described the kinds of roles he plays with a simple phrase, doofuses mostly. It's funny. But it's also misleading, because playing a fool convincingly isn't easy. Making an audience believe that a ridiculous character is completely sincere requires control. And Buster Scruggs required even more. Nelson had to make the comedy feel real. The singing had to feel real. The gunplay had to feel real. Even the cowboy swagger had to feel like something Buster had been doing his entire life. And somehow, he pulled it off. Then came another twist. A few years later, Nelson would play another cowboy in Old Henry. But this time, the character was almost the complete opposite of Buster Scruggs. Buster treated his gun like a toy, a piece of theater, something to show off. Old Henry treated a gun as something dangerous and necessary, quiet, controlled, minimal. And Nelson had to prepare all over again. He spent months working on the character's voice, movement, physicality, and gun handling. The result was a performance that made people look back at Buster differently, because now you could see the difference. Buster wasn't proof that Tim Blake Nelson was secretly a natural cowboy. Buster was proof that Tim Blake Nelson was incredibly good at becoming someone he wasn't. And that, to me, is the real story. The fascinating thing about Nelson's career isn't that he suddenly discovered how to play cowboys. It's that he's spent decades disappearing into people who look nothing like him. The awkward guy, the idiot, the nervous guy, the strange guy, the comedian, the villain, the father, and eventually, the gunslinger. But underneath all of them is the same actor. Someone who seems to question himself before almost every challenge, then quietly does the work until the doubt disappears. That's what happened with Buster Scruggs.